Well, good morning, everybody. I think we're just waiting for a couple more, but hopefully they'll join us very soon. But we'll get started as soon as it's 10 o'clock. So I hope you're all well this morning, and welcome to the second session of the Planning to Reopen webinars led by Ben Melham from Mortice Consulting. The session again is being live captioned, and if you want to enable those so you can see them, if you go to the control panel, hopefully at the bottom of your screen, it should say closed caption, and if you click on that you can enable them. If you can't see that, if you click on the dots, the more, you should be able to see the closed caption thing there, and they'll also appear on the recording. As before, the session is being recorded, so if you want to turn your camera off, you're more than welcome, but we're happy to see your nice smiley faces, so if you want to keep them on, that's great. Throughout the session we'll be using the chat function. It was really great on Tuesday. There was loads of things coming through, so please do post your questions or top tips or any resources throughout, and I'm sure Ben will be asking you to do something with your homework links later on. And I'll hand over to Ben now to lead the session, and hope you have a good day. Thanks.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Kay. Great to see you all again. I can see a few of you, so good morning. Before I disappear behind the PowerPoint, I thought I'd just say hello. We've got the second session today, so we've got quite a bit to get through. As we were just discussing, the chat function was really useful, and what I'm really keen for you to do is that you can use it to communicate with us, but also use it to communicate with each other if you've got ideas, questions, observations. As we talked about in the first session, there's an awful lot of guidance available. It's being applied in various different ways. So if you have suggestions, ideas, challenges, questions, use the chat function to put that up, and we'll try and engage in the conversation as much as possible. So yeah, really looking forward to working with you all today. And as we get through quite a few fairly important topics and quite a bit to cover off. So I shall pull up my slides first of all. So first of all, can I have a thumbs up from those of you? Can you see the slides and still hear me? Brilliant. That is a great start. Always good when the technology works. So with the first session, we discussed a lot about just the broader context setting, thought about identifying some of the key challenges. So hopefully you took away from that maybe some things you hadn't thought about previously. And then it was great to hear the case study, which I thought from Dr. Priory, which was really interesting, and get to hear actually how this has been put into practice. We talked about some case studies from across the UK and internationally, and then we've started to look at the trends about how people are reopening. So we looked at the big picture piece in the last session, and today is where we're really going to go into these, what I've called focus points, but areas of operation that just deserve a bit of time and thought to think about how we're going to go through these. So we're going to start off talking about visitor social distancing. Then we're going to be talking about staff welfare, and when often, I'm going to keep reiterating this, when I talk about staff, I'm also thinking about volunteers as well. Also then we need to think about toilets and lifts. So kind of maybe not the most exciting topics, but incredibly important when it comes to visitor experience. And we'll also be looking at why those are so important as well. And then in the second session this morning, we're going to talk about cleaning regimes, cleaning frequencies, what you need to be doing, thinking about cafes and shops. And I'm sure maybe shops is one we're going to have an interesting discussion about. A couple of other groups I'm involved in at the moment are debating particularly around face coverings and application in a retail environment versus a museum retail environment. So that may be a discussion as much as a conclusive answer on that one, but I'm happy to cover that off. And also mindful that a lot of you got outdoor areas, outdoor play areas, car parks, and we're just going to look to cover some of that off in the second session. So that's a kind of new update for this one. And then we're going to kind of finish up. We've been thinking about all of this, and one of the messages that hopefully you've been getting from this session is of the importance to communicate with your visitors, both before they attend site, whilst they're on site, and that ongoing engagement with them as the world around us changes, and also with our staff as well. This is not a single line in the sand where we communicate with our staff around COVID restrictions and then stop. The restrictions will change, and we need to keep thinking about how those change and how we keep communicating with our staff and visitors. And that's really important about evolving our model in terms of staff management, volunteer management, and visitor experience, that it keeps everybody happy and enjoyable within our sites. And then we'll finish up by just summarizing where we are today. So as I said, there's a kind of a lot of kind of fairly pithy points we're going to get to. Again, our strategy is going to be to point you in the direction of guidance if we're not able to go into everything in full detail. But I've really tried to distill some of the key ideas and also to support them with case studies from institutions around the UK primarily, where you can look and kind of get some ideas and some inspiration about what you might be doing. The message I'm going to keep coming back to is when you see these ideas and these suggestions, these have all been risk assessed locally, and you need to be thinking about how you can risk assess them. So they kind of make sure you do that risk assessment at a local level. Okay, the first session is called Service Areas in Focus. However, what we're going to do first, I set you all a very small piece of homework to do, which was to go and either identify a piece of guidance you've already looked at, a podcast, a quote. And what I'm going to encourage you to do now is to place it into the chat function, either as a link or just a comment. If you haven't got the link to hand, you could just say AIM's governance page around COVID and all the advice they're given. So you can put it in text format. If you've got the link, fantastic. But if you get you all kind of using the chat function again, so if you can share those, and equally just explain why you found it particularly useful. So while you're doing that, I'm just going to be nattering away because, as we talked about in previous sessions, as the world is changing rapidly around us and there isn't a clear set of rules that we all need to adhere to, one of the best things we can be doing is sharing best practice with each other, sharing ideas and sharing our challenges through networks like this one and other networks you may be involved in. So it's really important that we start to kind of get that information out now. So the AIM Museum's reopening checklist, I think it's a great resource actually. I think it's really easy to use. They've obviously put a lot of thought into it. I think it's a really good starting point if you're planning for reopening. And I think it's, I think if you haven't already looked at it, I would be encouraging you to go and look at that one. The reopening for the Southeast Museum Development Reopening Toolkit, yeah, another really useful checklist. So as I said previously, I think there's some really great resource in. There's a lot of the support bodies for the sector have put a lot of time and effort into considering how they can best pull together what is fairly limited guidance, but in a meaningful way, and sharing that best practice. So I see a few people tapping away, so I'll allow you to continue doing that. So from Fergus, the HSE website, and there's a few interesting pointers there. I think this is about particularly around COVID in terms of its impact. I think it's really useful to kind of be thinking about that broader context, particularly in your planning. I think it's also to be really good to be mindful of that when you're thinking about communicating with your staff and volunteers, and also as a way of understanding what their concerns may be. If you understand the particular risk profiles of some of your staff and volunteers particularly, it then helps you to communicate with them and come up with your solution. And also as well, I think it's very good that although there's a lot of national level guidance, there's an awful lot of communication going on at a local level. And when you're planning for reopening and opening up within your local context and engaging with your local community, understanding the challenges and risks around that are really important to allowing you to reopen in a way that's going to engage your community. And ultimately, what we're trying to do with our staff, our visitors, our volunteers, is make them feel comfortable to come back onto site. So the more you can do to understand what their fears are, the more likely it is that you can make them comfortable. So there's one from Lynette talking about British Library and just talking about the kind of, it was an email about welcoming emails back, and they just obviously just highlighting there the reassuring tone and the fact it's building on feedback. So I think it's really useful. Obviously, you want to make people feel comfortable coming back onto site, and even just in the way you communicate, you can give a great degree of comfort. You want to put across how your competency in terms of that you've thought about things. We talked yesterday about potentially publishing risk assessments online to give people maximum comfort. Not many people will go through and read those, although some people will. But it's how you, in simple ways, that you manage to get that message across that you have thought about and reopen the sites. And in the later session, in the session 4 today, we're going to talk about communication strategies, and we're going to be looking at things like the visiting bin, kite mark, and others in terms of methodologies that you can look to apply to give people reassurance quite quickly. And just looking at on the rest of the list here, and so there's one from Joggins Fossils Cliffs. Sorry, I don't know which, if that's just the Fossil Centre, Joggins Fossil Centre. I see that now on the link, and just like the way they communicate. And again, this is what I said. There's fantastic opportunity to look at your peer organisations and see what's working for them and that they put thought in. And I do, again, one of my great joys about working in this sector is actually we are incredibly collaborative. I don't feel that we're necessarily in hard-nosed commercial competition as you would be if you're in other sectors. And there's a real ability and willingness to share information. And obviously, I'd always encourage if you are going to be looking to kind of seek resources from other sites, that you look to engage with them and build that to be a conversation with them about sharing information, rather than just, you can just go onto their website and kind of get inspiration, as it were. But I would encourage you to engage with them where possible. And also as well, that you're putting up some great suggestions here. We talk about Joggins Fossil Centre, the British Library. Give feedback. If this is kind of coming to you either as a visitor or as a peer, why not kind of just give them some feedback? Because I know a lot of people have put a lot of time and effort into this reopening planning, as you are all doing yourselves. I'm sure you would appreciate it if people recognise that for you. So from Tessa, a great long list there, sort of some National Museum Directors Council, AIMS, National Archives, embed guidelines. So the embed guidelines, I definitely encourage you to go and have a look at this. They've done a lot of good work. It's something I was actually involved in as well. And just not forgetting all of our visitors. And I think one of the things, a theme we will talk about today, is a number of the measures that you could put into place fairly quickly will work for a significant portion of your visitors, but it won't work for all your visitors. And I think one of the big risks in reopening of museums is that we actually put in place measures that are restrictive to visitors with certain needs and requirements when visiting sites. And actually, we could be taking steps backwards in all the hard work that's taken place in recent years. A number of you will always find it difficult, either financially, investment-wise, to make your sites as accessible as possible. But you would have put a lot of work into doing this. So we just need to be mindful that in this short period of time, we don't take too many steps backwards that we can't come from. And ultimately, I'm sure that all of you want to open up all of your sites to as many visitors as possible. And we really need to think about this as well. So I think it's a really important one to keep reminding ourselves about as we go through. Face mask advice looks like from March onwards, and it's about face coverings. That looks like it's from University of Oxford, so potentially Oxford University Museums. That may be coming from. Focus has put that one up. Maisie said the Visit Britain We're Good to Go standard. We're going to talk about that one later. I've got a couple of slides on that. A number of institutions are using that as their mark on their websites in publicising to visitors that they have gone through the checklist. It's not a particularly onerous task to do, so I'd suggest you look at that one, and we'll talk about that later. One from Danielle here saying from the Harris, just their welcome back page. And I think there's a real tone piece that needs to be thought about in all this. And I really like the kind of welcome back piece. This is the kind of the welcoming, rather than overburdening your visitors with this. Here are the rules, here are the restrictions straight off. You can't do this, you can't do this, this is closed. You want to engage with them and make them feel comfortable about coming back onto site. So think about how you want to be engaged. And yeah, welcoming is a term that I really like and something to think about. And also just remember that when we think about welcoming back, this is, as we very much going to talk about today, it's about operations. It's about welcoming people back to make them feel comfortable to use the toilets, to use the lifts. It's all of those facilities as well that make people feel comfortable in a space and make them feel relaxed. So you've got to make sure there's a consistent tone. So it may be all very well and good that your galleries are nice and welcoming and there's staff there, and then they get to the toilets and there's a sign saying, don't do this, don't do that, or they're closed, or something that's very unwelcoming. You need a consistent visitor experience where possible. And also, you need consistency in order to not confuse your visitors as they walk around the site. Yeah, so the Visit Britain industry standard, we'll talk about that again later. And looking at a lot of things about engaging volunteers. So I think that's one of the topics that's actually starting to come up now, that I think in reopening planning, there was a lot of discussion initially just about physically how to meet the government guidelines and get the building reopened. I think volunteers were maybe not thought about as much, and staff as well, but I think everybody's coming around to that. And I think the best planning that I've seen really has staff and volunteers at the heart, and where possible, full engagement with them. Because ultimately your staff and volunteers, particularly those in front of house roles, are going to have to deliver this and explain the rationale to your visitors and why there's restrictions in place. You need them on board with you as you go through this. So some really great content there. And as we go through today, by the way, I'll put up certain suggestions. There's going to be links going up of things that we think are really useful. But if you equally have resources, please do put them up. There's a lot out there. And if you found it useful, and if you give a little explanation of why it is, then there's likely that somebody else on the training course today will also find it useful. So thank you to everybody for your chat so far, and keep this one going. Again, I think I mentioned this on the last course, and this is the kind of, if you have kind of mantras when you're thinking about reopening planning, I just really like this one. I think the quote was attributed to Bernard Donahue from Alva, but I've heard this one in several places and I just really liked it, and saying, we need to sanitize the building, but not the experience. And I think this is key. We're going to talk very much around the practical measures on what you can do to get them reopened. but ultimately the tone, the welcoming nature of your institution is going to be very personalized to you, and you need to think about how you can convey that through all of these measures and make that go through. Yeah, so Kay's just coming on the chat. They said we'll circulate the links. Absolutely. If they're not going up there, and I talk about links in the presentation, we'll make sure you get all of these as well. So we're going to go through a number of focus points. This is the first one, visitor social distancing. So social distancing is the thing that we've been talking about right from the beginning of lockdown. It comes up in every conversation. It's one of the trends that we see globally. It's one of the solutions that's being implemented everywhere you are. But we're going to talk today about how do you actually implement visitor social distancing on site? How much can you control your visitors, and what can be done about this? So managing visitor capacity, I think it was actually one of the questions in the chat we talked about last time, and a lot of people have said, well, how do we actually manage the capacity? And this is from the National Museum Directors Council guidelines. You know, before I've mentioned back to this, it's been developed with National Museum Directors Council, AIM, and a number of other organisations who have been heavily involved in this. So there's lots of voices in here, but I think, again, this is a really good summary to start off with. The first line I think is really interesting and actually probably quite a powerful message. It said, we need to create the conditions where visitors can stay alert and practice social distancing etiquette. So what's not coming out from either from National Museum Directors Council or central government is saying, you have to physically control social distancing. Very much the tone and the message is you need to create an environment where social distancing can be maintained, but they understand equally there's always going to be a measure that you have to rely on the behaviours of your visitors, of your staff, of your volunteers, and you can't always physically control that. But there's a lot you can do to encourage the correct behaviours and, where possible, create constraints that means they have to operate in a certain way. But I think you need to be comfortable about the measures you put in place, as we always said, but don't expect to be able to control visitor social distancing the whole time, because if you did, that would be incredibly resource intensive and you'd need bodies all over the ground, and it would become, we talk later very much about policing as a strategy, which is going to be incredibly difficult to do if you've got low resources. So let's just keep that in mind. We start off going that there is an acceptance that there's only so much you can do with visitor social distancing. However, it is one of the key strategies from central government about mitigating the transmission of COVID between individuals. So it is a really important one still to think about. Also as well, people have asked, how do we actually calculate visitor capacity for social distancing? It's really difficult. Most of you would have fire risk assessments for your buildings. These are actually, you can calculate these, and there are models that you can create. For visitor social distancing, there's a whole number of other variables that come in that make it incredibly difficult. So some people would do a raw measure and kind of look at floor area for the whole building as a guidance. Ultimately, you are going to have to look at your individual spaces and get a sense of how you think it would be possible for visitors to maintain social distancing. And as is pointed out here, some people will attend in groups as well. So it's not going to be a finite number, that people could be in family groups or in small groups that would alter the capacity. As I said previously, don't forget you need to include your staff and your volunteers when looking at this. There's probably going to be no finite answer. I'd encourage you, actually, one of the things I've seen from a number of institutions is just walk the site. Go through the spaces, get a sense of how many people you think you can physically inspire in a space, identify pinch points, and then look at those pinch points. And maybe it involves putting one-way routes in, maybe it involves limiting numbers in particular areas and managing people through certain routes, or maybe, as we're seeing increasingly, particularly in a number of small institutions, it's putting up the guidance, it's engaging with visitors before they attend site and encouraging them to have the right behaviours, and maybe intervening in very extreme circumstances, but limiting. I would say that getting involved does potentially put your front of house staff in scope for a lot of conflict with visitors, so you need to think really carefully about that. So as the guidance says, make visitors aware and encourage compliance rather than having to actively police it. And their final point here, and if this is a reassurance to you, this is what the National Museum Directors Council guidance is saying: where calculating exact floor space of the space is complex, museums may find a more logical approach is to carefully manage flow of visitors. So their view is it's about messaging, it's about managing flow of visitors. It's not about coming up with a finite figure that says, here's X number of people in this space. That's not what we're looking to achieve here. But you may be able to use that data to calculate your bottom line in terms of overall visitor capacity for a building or a space. So how do we actually manage the people within the spaces, and what can we do? And the guidance states, and just to kind of reiterate, it is 2 meters is still the guidance. However, it's 1 meter social distancing if you've got mitigation in place. So that mitigation, as with a lot of the guidance, this comes down to you. So mitigations is part of your risk assessment about whether you feel that those mitigations are acceptable and reduce the risk. They're encouraging you to maintain 2 meters where viable. As we discussed previously, a number of the larger institutions are sticking with 2 meters as their guidance, and this is what they're still telling visitors to do on site. And they said, and it's all about kind of maintain distance, particularly with staff, and think about your staff and your visitors as 2 very kind of different groups, but they will be interacting in the same place. Don't forget about your staff when you're planning social distancing. This is not just about the shop front and doing the right thing for the visitors. Ultimately, the care and priority of your staff should be right at the top of what you're doing. Wear face coverings where distances of 2 meters cannot be kept apart in indoor environments where possible. So this is government guidance, and we're going to come on to later, particularly around face coverings. There's a rapidly changing conversation around face coverings, and actually there's a number of institutions on a couple of WhatsApp groups that I help coordinate who even today are saying they're looking to follow the retail guidance and thinking actually maybe they're going to, when they reopen, they are going to reopen with face covering. They're planning to reopen with encouraging visitors to wear face coverings. So I think this is something that is changing as we speak. So this is really important. This is the Alva visitor data. I think this is quite an interesting slide to look at. Just highlighted in the red box is about visitor expectation. The question is, which of these measures would make you feel more comfortable about visiting? And kind of nearly 50% are saying distancing measures and queues around site, limiting numbers of visitors on site at one time, maximising distance from staff. These are all kind of coming kind of green in the kind of much more comfortable or a little more comfortable. It's pretty much looking at about 80% for all these measures. So physically, one, doing them, and also the other one, communicating to your visitors before they attend site and when they attend site that you're doing them, will make your visitors a lot more comfortable and therefore a lot more likely to attend site. So this is what the data is showing. I mean, there's various different surveys going out. The Alva one seems pretty well respected, but I'd take this as kind of a reasonable signpost to think about distancing when visitors come to site. I think also social distancing is one of the measures that's been in place for a significant period of time, and that people are really used to it as a measure, and it's something they'd expect to see. So how can you actually limit numbers overall? Advanced online booking for time slots. However, what I would say is a number of institutions we're talking to, although they're saying they're encouraging online booking, a number of them have mitigations in place, and a couple we spoke to, actually, we did a training course for the Yorkshire region yesterday, and they had Jorvik was speaking, and they said they did have iPads for staff available, so for visitors who did turn up, they could do online booking on the spot, as it were, kind of, and they had a process in place for that. You don't have to do online booking. So this is one of the things that everyone's saying. I think we talked yesterday, it was on the chat, to our previous session, and we said, I think it's Arts Fund, so Kay will put the link on there or nod at me, who actually have a kind of a ticketing platform that you can potentially get access to. So have a look at that. You can manage numbers in other ways. You could, if you're a small site, you could just be effectively counting visitors in and out, if that's your way to manage visitor numbers. You don't have to do online ticketing. However, it is a tool that's being used a lot, and a lot of people are expecting to see this. And then the fact that you may need front of house staff monitoring, particularly if you have constrained spaces or rooms within your site or buildings. Or another strategy is a number of sites are reopening with those confined spaces closed in the first instance. And if you're going to do that, communicate that to your visitors. And just, there may be parts of your site you just don't feel comfortable that social distancing can be maintained, and you may just not be able to open parts of those sites. So I think at the moment, visitors will be quite accepting of that, particularly if you've communicated to them when they're booking a ticket or at the point before they commit any money or before they enter site. I think it's a really useful thing to do. And as with all of these, communication, we're going to keep talking about that. Just be really clear to all of your visitors about what they can expect on site. And we'll talk more later about videos, about social media, about just kind of even just having a chalkboard at the entrance that says, this is what's open and this is what's not open. So before they even walk in, they've got that sense. And what I'm really mindful of is a lot of front of house staff work really hard, and where possible, it's your responsibility, or volunteers, you can reduce the opportunities for conflict. The more that people know before they get to a point that it's not going to be open, the less chance there's going to be of conflict with visitors. I'm sure it's a very small number, but there's always potential there if there's frustration that people attended site to see something particularly. So as we talked about, communicate with people. This is just from Kew Gardens. So actually, when you go to book your tickets, they're being really clear about that not everything's going to be open, about what some of the restrictions are that are in place, about what to expect. And like I said, the uptake on sites that are open for pre-booking at the moment, from the ones that I've heard, is actually pretty good uptake. However, one of the drop-offs is, particularly if you're a free-to-enter site and tickets are free, or you have members who don't have to pay, is there's actually a really high dropout rate. I think Alval quoting a figure about 40% from sites they've been surveying of people booking multiple time slots, and maybe just they book one up for every day and they'll just turn up on the day the weather's nice. So it's something just to think about. What I think one of the mitigations for that is probably if those are members groups or others, is encouraging them with nice positive messaging and just explaining to them about the restrictions and the impact that may have. I think you can just there are ways to work around this, but it's probably a challenge that will level out, hopefully. Again, social distancing. I like this one. This is from actually from a Swiss transport museum. Really simple imaging. Don't make it any more complicated than that. I really like the image on the left. For me, that just says, I think really quickly, look, you can have to keep 2 meters apart, but you might be in a couple, so you can be together. You might be in a family group, you can be together. I just like this really nice, clear, simple messaging. There's no need to overcomplicate some things. So you might have all the detail on your site, but maybe these are the little reminders as you walk around the site, just to wash your hands, to keep your distance, some of those key measures, and avoid the risk of just bombarding your entire site with signage everywhere, because all of the studies have shown that visitors have a limited attention span when it comes to signage. So be choosy about what you put up. Before they even walk into the building, kind of like to engage with them outside, get them used to the fact that people want to keep part. This one's from the Rijksmuseum, I think, over in Amsterdam, and just encourage people in a nice, soft, friendly way to start engaging and thinking about how they might be needing to keep apart when they get inside as well. So encourage social distancing, signage. Think about your staff, avoid shared workstations, so think about their operating procedures. Use floor tape or paint to mark areas to help keep 2 meters distancing. One thing I would say, and we'll touch on it later, if you've got historic fabric, really think about what adhesives you're using, paints. Just please, I would hate to think any historic fabric got damaged as a result of people putting signage down that may have to be there for some time. You may be putting down floor stickers and thinking, oh, this is just for the reopening. If restrictions may be in place, that signage could quite easily be there for 12 months, 18 months. So think about the longevity as well. And they talk about at the moment is closing indoor areas and soft play areas, although because of high touch points and just other areas and interactors is something that we talked about as well. So signage, this one was quite interesting, bottom left. I think it's from a German museum, and they were actually, it's more the staff, I think, and they were using it with some visitors to educate them, to explain. This is 1.5 meters, I think, in Germany, but they were walking around the site, kind of explaining how you maintain that distancing. And I think with people, when you explain to them, there's still, even a meter is quite a long way, and a lot of people don't understand this. I saw one museum in America, they had large foam circles that they put around themselves that were a meter and a half in diameter, or it would have been 3 meters in diameter, but all the way around them. And then their staff would be walking the site and seeing where the pinch points were, that kind of real physicality. I think it's a really interesting one. I think you could get a 2 meter long pole and just kind of get a sense of, or a 1 meter long pole and get a sense of what that distancing is. Again, floor markings. There's some companies making a lot of money selling signage. Again, I try and keep it on brand where possible, and also think about how the guidance may change. And a lot of people spend a lot of money on 2 meter signage, and they now want to move away from 2 meters. That's all gone to waste potentially. So think about that. And also with the floor stickers, think about what people are used to seeing in a retail environment at a supermarket. The more you can make them utilize methodologies they're comfortable with, that they've used elsewhere, I think the better. So where people cannot be 2 meters apart, manage transmission risk. So this is particularly around staff. Sorry, my mouse is just not letting me click on. There it goes. And think about ways of working, back-to-back or side-to-side working, putting protective screens up between staff. And then we talked before about maybe putting them in shift patterns or bubbles. So maybe some staff have to work together, but you can limit the exposure of those staff and volunteers to other groups as well. So I appreciate some of you may not have the luxury of these kind of numbers, but it's something that you do need to be thinking about, because probably one of the highest chances of transmission risk is actually going to be between people who are spending a significant period of time together, like staff and volunteers. So you really need to think about that. And I also know it's been flagged that obviously across the UK, a large number of the volunteers are themselves in potentially at-risk categories as well, higher risk categories. So you need to really think about protection of those individuals as well. Policing social distancing. So just a quick one, and just an encouragement to think about what we're not seeing so much of is massive front of house presence or volunteer presence to manage visitors. There's potential a lot of room for conflict. If it gives you any comfort, if you are encouraging your visitors to do the right things, this is a trend that we are seeing more broadly. It's about signage, it's about engagement. Don't feel you need to police your visitors. However, you may need to intervene if there are particular issues. The biggest fear that visitors have is actually other visitors. and one of their biggest concerns about coming back to site is how other visitors will behave. I don't think this is a particularly good example. I don't know which museum this is, but potentially here as well, thinking around, there's no one-way routes, you've got people interacting, there's a potential a lot of room for conflict in a scenario like this one. And again, managing visitor movement. So one-way routes, this is something we're seeing a lot of. The Rijksmuseum, a rather large museum, has the luxury to have 3 routes as you go through the institution. Again, just make it clear. People think about one-way routes. It doesn't have to be a single one-way route around your entire site. It can just be one-way routes around particular areas. Again, be consistent in your signage so your visitors get used to it. You don't necessarily need to develop a single route that takes everyone around, because there's another risk with that is potentially that you create bottlenecks and a lot of layback from people trying to move around the site. So it can just be small one-way systems, maybe in a particular room or a gallery where there's limited space. You may just, as we saw in the video in our last session, just have a one-way route around that particular room or gallery, just to encourage that behaviour that you hope would be in place anyway. I'm talking quite quickly, by the way, so do on the chat, you can kind of ask questions as we go through. There's an awful lot of content to cover off. So now we're going to move on to staff and volunteer welfare and protection. Obviously, thinking very much around primarily how do we make our staff and volunteers safe, and also about how we make them feel comfortable and happy to be in the workplace. Because if they're not happy and comfortable, that's going to cause us a significant number of issues as we go through our reopening planning as well. So safe workplaces, again, from the National Museum Directors Council guidance. You guys, we've already signposted this one to you. I'd encourage you to have a look, but I just want to pick this one up. They're talking about safe workplaces. So thinking about providing safe spaces to store bags, clothes, tools, equipment away from workspaces. So we talked about cloakrooms in the previous session about the fact that most places have those closed, but equally think about the equipment, the tools, everything else, that these are potential contamination points. So where possible, you may want to ensure that your staff and volunteers have areas where they can put that, where there's a reduced risk of contamination, where it may be providing them with boxes or lockers if you have them, or just spaces. And equally, if you're operating your teams in bubbles or in shifts, that then providing spaces that are just dedicated to that shift or that bubble. Just look at all the ways, if you've got limited space, to mitigate these, to think about that. Reduce unnecessary movement around buildings. So it seems like a bit of an obvious one, but if you're encouraging your staff to come to meetings or to move around, or if they've got walkarounds that they're doing, think about how all of that is a potential for them to be cross-contaminating and moving into different areas they don't need to be going into. So although we talk about shifts, another way to operate sites potentially is thinking about it in terms of areas of the building. So you may be dedicating particular teams. If, for example, you have a cleaning team or cleaners, and rather than having multiple cleaners move around the whole building and doing the whole thing, you might think about separating them and allocating them to different parts of the building, for example. So just think about how your staff and your volunteers move around the building. A lot of people operate rotation systems, particularly staff and volunteers, for various reasons. It may be for comfort, because there's cold out buildings and warmer internal areas. These are potential, again, opportunities for this transmission. You may need to engage with your staff and work with them to think, and the volunteers to think about how you can maybe just ensure that they locate in individual areas, something to think about. That's not without its challenges either. Think about security and access devices. So you may have cards, you may have entry points, door handles. Again, thinking about all of these points of contact your staff and volunteers may be going through that others wouldn't need to go through. And don't forget staff and volunteer areas in your cleaning regime. So there's a lot of focus on cleaning for visitor, but don't forget that your staff areas equally need to be cleaned and potentially deep cleaned on a regular basis as well. So you need to be thinking around this as well. Encourage telephone and radio communication. So some of you may have access to radios, to telephones, to video conferencing, even just in terms of day-to-day operation. If you maybe you have a habits of people just kind of going to find colleagues to communicate with them to address issues, maybe there's opportunities to communicate in slightly different ways that just reduce that opportunity for them to be moving around site. And then there's the physical measures like installing perspex screens to shield workers, particularly those who are coming into the public. So there's a lot more guidance out there. I just picked out a few of them that I think it'd be useful for you to be thinking about. And also as well, just one final point on this, we talk about visitors a lot in terms of access requirements and signage and everything else. Don't forget that a number of your staff and volunteers may have particular requirements in terms of accessibility and others that you may also need to think about with your measures. So don't forget that it's just as likely that your staff or volunteers will have particular access needs as well. So just consider that in terms of your solutions. So what's the guidance saying? It's a deep cleaning, hand washing, hygiene procedures. So hand washing is one of the number one ways to minimize the transmission of coronavirus. So make sure you encourage particularly your staff, provide them the opportunity if they're in static positions to have access to hand gel and other ways of cleaning. So provide hand sanitizer around the workplace. Think about your cleaning regime. So this is another opportunity to really work with your teams and your volunteers to understand where are they most intensely working, where are they coming together. Those points may be the ones that you need to ensure are deep cleaned. You may not have the luxury of having multiple restrooms or multiple kitchens and breakout areas. So if everyone's using the same breakout area, your staff and volunteers, I'd be suggesting that that should be really targeted as a route for cleaning. And potentially even access to those spaces, you may want to kind of manage on a shift, on a bubble. If you've got various shifts and bubbles working, that they all enter those areas in the same way, and where possible, the cleaning's encouraged. If you operate a small site, it might be as well that you just making cleaning products available to your staff and your volunteers. So either you're encouraging them to, or just giving them the option that they can clean areas as well as their kind of particularly high contact point areas. So they can be doing that as well if they wish. And you need to risk assess locally how much, and I don't know the roles of your individual staff or volunteers in whether cleaning is involved in those roles, but you may need to think about that one. And so then just setting clear guidance, even for your staff and your volunteers, around guidance to toilets and hand drying facilities, paper towels or electric dryers. So this is one that a number of people have talked about, the benefit. A lot of people have turned off their electric hand dryers. So we've seen people to move towards paper towels. I've been looking at the evidence on this one. There are some studies that suggest that hand dryers provide an opportunity to kind of spread, potentially, because not everyone cleans their hands that well, that spreads contamination. Some of the guidance out there saying that paper towels are better than hand dryers, particularly those, if you've seen the drop-in hand dryers that are made by a company that also makes hoovers, or vacuum cleaners, I should say, and that there's been a lot of studies even prior to COVID that these are actually quite can provide a concentration for contamination and build up of contagions. So thinking about the opportunity for people to dry their hands and when they use toilet facilities and others. So PPE and face coverings, and particularly staff visitors. So it is not currently obligatory for staff or visitors to wear face coverings in a museum setting, although we are now hitting a bit of a grey area, particularly when we're talking about retail environments and the new guidance that's come out. And effectively, the guidance says, unless you're in a setting that pre-COVID would have required full PPE and requirements, you don't necessarily need it going forward. Again, I would say you need to risk assess locally. I can't tell you you should or shouldn't wear PPE. You need to risk assess, and saying obviously they're encouraging this as government advice around kind of hand washing, around using face coverings. But we are seeing increasingly a number of sites using face coverings and PPE for staff. You have to risk assess and also engage with your staff. So some PPE wearing may be one of the measures that you need to put in place to make your staff and your volunteers feel comfortable. If you are going to do this and you're thinking about reopening, you may need to think about stockpiling PPE for your to make it available. There's obviously high demands on PPE procurement. Again, I don't know how you kind of operate within your networks locally. Potentially, maybe you think about PPE procurement kind of in a group setting. I don't know if there are any initiatives in your region for doing that. Also, just about consistency and cost. There's varying costs, and PPE is a bit of a seller's market at the moment when it comes to PPE. So really think about that. Also, if you're going to provide, if you're going to require your visitors to wear face coverings, you may need to think that you need to build up a stock to potentially provide some to your visitors, unless you wanted to turn them away, because the number won't turn up with it, even if you do make it very clear. So with PPE and face coverings, what I'd say is risk assess locally, risk assess individual situations, particularly those points where people come into close physical contact. Follow guidance, whether it be nationally or locally, around PPE, and think about what those potential solutions are. So what I'm saying, so what is the approach to face coverings at the moment? From the tracker data we showed in the last session, the majority of sites are currently not saying they require face coverings. However, Two recent reopenings in London, the National Gallery and the Royal Academy are saying actually they're encouraging visitors to wear face coverings. So they're not kind of mandating it. I think the Royal Academy are maybe on a slightly harder line, but they are encouraging people, obviously accepting, and there will be more detail in this and caveats, that people with certain medical conditions or others can't necessarily wear them. And normally there are age restrictions in place, and a lot of sites are saying that under a certain age that there's not a requirement to wear them, understanding that children of a particular age won't be able to cover them. For airline travel, I think it's currently about 3 years and under is what they're saying. Kay's handy put on some of the links to the government guidance about when to wear face masks and PPE and when not. But the central government guidance is that PPE isn't required unless you're in a clinical setting, full PPE, but you do need to risk assess locally. So this is a fairly new slide. I just pulled this one together because this is kind of coming out as we speak at the moment. So we've recently, within the past 48 hours, had the announcement from government about retail environments and the requirement to wear face coverings. I believe there's actually financial penalties will be involved for people not wearing them. This creates, for me, a number of grey areas, particularly around museum retail environments. From other networks I've been involved in, those who are applying that rule to their museum retail area and saying, well, it's a retail environment, we're wanting to be cautious and to manage this. So we're encouraging people to wear face coverings. A number of sites I know who have reopened without the need to wear face coverings are very seriously considering introducing it as a policy. They're either to be in line with the kind of the broader public consensus and making them feel comfortable, but equally just preempting further guidance that comes out. Again, this slide here probably highlights some of the differences that we see in terms of opinion. So the fact that it's coming into force within shops, but Matt Hancock has really come out and said that it's not for offices and office environments. There's a whole load of there's a lot of grey areas here, and the argument I think against offices was that these people, they're effectively working in bubbles, although there is a high risk of contamination. What I'd say is watch this space, and my continual advice is keep an eye on the guidance as it changes. And also, just in the middle there, this is from the BBC website, when we're talking about kind of PPE and face coverings, so they're particularly talking primarily about face coverings, the lower one. They're not talking about kind of full medical PPE, and these can be homemade. There's a lot of guidance out there. I think the guidance that Kay's put up actually goes into more detail about what makes acceptable face coverings, that it's got to be kind of tight around the nose, and seeing a number of people who wear their face masks but with their noses exposed. I'm not sure they're fully understanding the benefits of wearing them. But face coverings is a key one that we need to be thinking about going forward. So we'll come on to kind of some of the more guidance putting out later, but this is obviously some of the guidance coming from the central government, and just saying, if you're doing all of these measures, you want to communicate with them with your visitors and with your staff, and setting out some of the key ones. So this is the fairly high level one that's been available from central government, I think Public Health England, right the way through lockdown, and there's new guidance and kite marks that are becoming available that we'll come on to later in the session. So collecting data for NHS track and trace. This is a fairly new one that's come in. And this is the guidance. This has come directly from the National Museum Directors Council guidance, and they've collaborated with Cabinet Office to prepare this guidance. And they said you should assist this service by keeping temporary record of your staff shift patterns, customer and visitors for 21 days in a way that is manageable for your business. So I think this is a really key message, that there isn't a single system. If you have ticketing data, if you've got people who are pre-win tickets, that's potentially a source for recording this. However, you may just be recording visitors on site. This is about how your site is managed. Again, it may be that you're just kind of taking a list of visitors as they attend. Obviously, you have to be very mindful of GDPR and making people clear that you are collecting this data and what the purpose it's being collected for. I think there's a certain amount of leeway with this. I know that because this is central government guidance that you should be doing this. I think the public generally accept this as a reason for doing it, particularly around staff and volunteers. Obviously, the people who are more likely to be in direct contact for significant periods of time, it's probably more likely where they're going to be focusing any track and trace data. And particularly with visitor numbers, you may have incredibly large numbers. I haven't actually seen any scenarios where a museum has been requested for this data and implemented. In the early days of pub reopening, I think the only examples I saw were actually from pubs who themselves chose to contact their their clients and say that there had been a confirmed case in the pub. I haven't actually seen any evidence of NHS track and trace contacting large volumes of people who have been at a site. It may very well happen still, but that's something, if anybody does have any examples, it'd be interesting to hear, particularly in a museum setting, and you can pop that into the chat function. I see Kay's just put a chat there about making your own face coverings. There's a bit of a cottage industry coming up around face coverings. We've had some made by a friend of ours, and also as well that seeing increasingly a number of sites either putting them out or looking at having branded face coverings and use it as a potential retail opportunity. It's something to think about. It might not be for everybody, but it is something that we are seeing there. And so obviously this is just the government guidance around track and tracing. I'll allow you to kind of go through this in great detail. I think hopefully you'll be fairly clear about the principles behind the track and trace data collecting, that if there is an outbreak, if there is confirmed cases, particularly and probably more likely to be a bunch of staff or volunteers. But also we talk around, I think it's a really important one here. We talked yesterday about the need for planning for closure. And obviously there's scenarios there we talk about local lockdowns like have happened recently in Leicester. Effectively, if you're running a small site and most of your staff and volunteers are in contact, this track and trace could effectively result in a local lockdown. If a member of staff or a volunteer is confirmed to have it, and then you're asked to be all people who've been in contact to go into isolation, I can't really tell whether it's 10 or 14 days at the moment, but that would effectively mean that your site would have to close for that period of time. So this reopening, this planning to unfortunately close again is a very real possibility. And I think particularly track and trace, and you can easily see scenarios here where this, particularly for smaller institutions, would have to close on fairly short notice. This could be effectively overnight or even on the day. So something definitely to think about in terms of your planning and in your risk assessments, thinking about one of them would be going, well, what do we do if we are requested by NHS track and trace to isolate all of those staff? You would effectively have to close the building. And so this is what the government is saying about staff. So just collecting the names of staff who work on the premises, contact numbers, dates and times. So effectively the shifts of the staff and volunteers, I would say. And then the customers and visitors, just saying just the name of the customer and visitor, contact phone number, date of visit, arrival. And if they interacted with only one member of staff, that's more for kind of retail environments. That's probably quite difficult to collect. I would encourage you to again look back at that data that said they're expected to do it in a way that's reasonable for your site. So try and capture this data in a meaningful way. Again, you've got to balance these off, that you could have effectively a clipboard and a pen and a piece of paper and get people to sign up. But is that a real kind of high contact point? Would you want people collecting the data? You might not have front of house staff who are able to kind of, because that could be quite time consuming. So you need to think about methodologies that can collect this data in a simple way. And effectively the ticket booking, if you can implement that, is one way to collect this data without having to take up time of your staff on site. So it's another reason potentially to encourage to think about pre-booking or online booking. So here's an example. This is actually from the Royal Academy. So they're publishing online. A lot of institutions aren't doing this, but they're trying to give as much information as possible and saying, actually, this is some of the information that they will be gathering, and that the fact they're just reassuring visitors that be stored only for 21 days and will only be provided to NHS track and trace. And they're giving a list of all the types of information they're looking to collect. So go and have a look at other websites, see what they're communicating. Again, as with everything, I'd encourage you to communicate with your visitors where possible on the information, and just make them very clear around what you're doing with that data. Again, another example from the National Trust, again, just explaining on their website that they're only going to hold the data for 21 days and what they're going to be collecting. It's about reassuring people. Data protection is a real hot topic at the moment, and there's a lot of people who are very passionate about data protection. So I think it's something you need to be really mindful of, particularly around track and trace data. And so also as well, just thinking about, so what are workforce safety and wellbeing objectives? Making sure your staff are safe, maybe keeping some staff who don't need to be on site away from site for a prolonged period of time. If they've managed to work remotely during lockdown, could they be kept remote? It's only bringing staff back to site who need to be there, and maintain social distancing wherever possible. So these are the core principles that we need to keep applying. And then just don't forget those people who are working from home. Just a little prompt here about making sure that they've got good working arrangements, that they've got that they potentially risk assessing their home workstation as well. It's something you really need to think about, just to prevent people who are working off sofas and kitchen tables the longer they work from home. And the physical and mental well-being. Again, we talked about this in the last session. Just really think about those staff, particularly those who aren't able to return to site, who are missing a lot of that social interaction. And there's some really good guidance out there about caring for your staff. Again, so this is just going through. We are, if you thought we were cantering through before, we are absolutely cantering through it today, but there's a lot of really good topics I want to cover off. And as I said before, hopefully, if we haven't answered the questions, by the way, I'm really happy that you contact me after the course, and I'm happy to take questions directly. Use the chat function now. And if there's time at the end of the session, I'll even be here to take some questions directly if you feel we've gone through anything too quickly. So toilets, as you know, one of my pet passions. I think they are incredibly undervalued. But as you'll see from this data, again from Alva, about levels of anxiety among people returning to sites. And about where people put things in terms of their anxiety, but also in terms of the fact that they think they would be able to use them. Top right, so high anxious but high use, toilets and cafes and indoor seating areas. These are what your visitors are really, really concerned about when they return to site. So having good solutions to these, and this is why we've got these particular topics. Toilets we'll talk about now, cafes and shops we'll talk about after the break. Incredibly important. And this statistic, I think, is a really useful one, saying if these facilities were closed when the museum reopened, would you return? And over 50% of visitors are saying that if the toilets were not open, they would not come back to site. And another 28% are saying the experience wouldn't be as good for them. So toilets are, statistically, according to this data, the most significant barrier, is a standalone barrier for people returning to site. And not having toilet facilities available. I appreciate that some of you may not even have toilet facilities. If you're a very small site, but you're in a local context and you encourage people potentially to use council-run toilets or other local amenities, this is where you may need to be engaging in that wider network again in your local community to ensure that there is access to those toilets, and that if somebody's attending your site and they need to go outside of your site to visit a toilet, that you've checked that those are open, and you may even have to reassure your visitors about the cleanliness and management strategies around those toilets. Yep, so the clear demand for services, especially toilets, to be made available for reopening. Half the market would not visit an attraction which did not have their toilets reopened. So these are important. And then then the Alva data is really good. It says, well, what would make you feel more comfortable if the toilets are open about using them? So a lot of people say staff permanently on hand to clean toilets and sinks. Again, as I said before, you've got to be pragmatic. In an ideal world, that probably would make a lot of people more comfortable. I doubt many of you, if any of you, have the resources to do this. And I know even the largest national institutions don't have resources to have permanent staff permanently on site. But they've got social distancing measures in place in the entrance and the queue. So these are things that you can manage without necessarily having staff present. So this is about queuing systems, standalone queuing systems for your toilets, marking on the floor, and actively managing the number of people in and out of the toilet at once. You could do this through staff. You could equally have a one-in, one-out policy. I was recently at the Royal Horticultural Society at Wisley, and they had a sign door saying one person in the toilets at a time, but they allowed visitors to manage that themselves, and they queued, and it seemed to be working quite well. Visitors are quite keen to do this and to follow measures. I think we need to kind of give our visitors a certain amount of trust. And the fact that for a significant number of people, the fact that there were no automatic hand dryers. So there's been a bit in the press about hand dryers. So whether valid or not, a significant portion of the visitors would feel more comfortable. Approaching about 50% would feel much more comfortable or a little more comfortable. So you need to think about some of these measures. As I said, we're trying to be pragmatic. From some of the examples you'll see, most museums and galleries are using signage, are using static measures rather than staff to manage these processes. And from what we're seeing, it seems to be working quite well. Visitors seem to want to behave in the right way. So government advice for opening toilets. Again, I'm not going to kind of dwell on this too much. Sorry, there's an awful lot of text on this slide. Apologies, it's a bit messy. But again, it's just about building awareness, encouraging good behaviour. We talk about hand washing. That's something that can be encouraged before people even come to site. Again, a risk I would really encourage you to avoid is that you just put signage everywhere and no one looks at anything. If you think the most important thing is hand washing and social distancing, keep your signage simple, and then trust that your visitors are now living in an entire world where there is social distancing measures in place, that they know what to do and how to behave in a number of areas. And The government advice is keep facilities ventilated where possible. So for some sites, that may be for toilets opening windows and having fresh airflow where possible within the toilet facilities. And then things like putting up a visible cleaning schedule. Again, just give your visitors comfort. If you can't have cleaners there all the time, the next best thing is to have a schedule clearly marked out where your visitors can see that the toilets are being cleaned on a regular basis, and that you're just reminding them that these facilities are cleaned, and that information is made available to them. So here's just a couple of examples. As I said, in the last few minutes of this session, I would try and give you some case studies. So this is the National Memorial Arboretum. I think it's Northamptonshire, and just very kind of examples of what they've done. So they've got markers on the floor to encourage people to keep their distance from each other. This picture of the urinals, slightly messy, but it does the job. Hopefully they'll come up with a slightly longer term solution, but effectively, even here, they're limiting the number of urinals in use to 2. There's ones that you can't get to without passing somebody else. So they're kind of really limiting and just kind of finding very practical ways. I know they're working on a more advanced solution, but sometimes the solutions can be quite practical. It can be about taking certain cubicles out if you have a number of them. Some of you may only have one toilet on site, and it may just be managing that one in, one out to the toilet where possible. Barriers, other solutions that come into place. How are sites managing the toilets? So just some examples. Several sites are limiting their number of toilets. So because they can only put enhanced cleaning regime and they've got limited resources, they're not opening all of their toilets. However, as I'd say, I keep saying that there are visitors who need access to the toilets. If you have a large site, by closing some of your toilets, you may be limiting the ability of those visitors to get to all parts of your site. So you need to think around this. And some are completely closing their toilets. I would say Hampton Court, this I think is when they only had the gardens open. But if you are having to close your toilets, I definitely communicate that out fairly early on. I think it's something we're not seeing in many places, and I think people are just trying to find solutions around it. And the only example of we've actually got a front of house staff managing toilet queues at the moment is at the Royal Academy in London. So again, the majority of people, 99% of institutions, are just using signage and guidance as a way to get people to use it. So here's some examples. World Health Organization on the right, this is their guidance for hand washing. Maybe this is something, maybe particularly in staff and volunteer areas where you want to give a bit more detail and encourage them. There's some really great videos online actually that you could look to be sharing, particularly with your staff and volunteers. And look at the one on the left from English Heritage. Again, what I say, fundamentally what you're saying is you're reminding people that they're being cleaned, you're requesting that they keep apart, and you're requesting they wash their hands. Keep the messaging simple, get them to get the basics right. They might do everything, but if you can just focus on those key areas, I think it's really useful. And as we continue to go through, Kay's doing a sterling job here, putting up some great resources and links as well, which will all be made available to you at the end of the session as well. So do look at those. And by the way, if any of you have any really good examples, then do please put them on there as well. A really good comment there from M. Cooks and Carter. Sorry, your name there is one long piece of word there. About bigger bins. Yeah, if you have a lot of paper towels, don't forget that there's going to be more waste produced potentially, and also as well that with waste, particularly around hand towels or any waste, we need to consider it as it's potentially contaminated waste. So it's not clinical waste, which is very different. So it can still go out in general waste streams, but particularly your staff, your volunteers, your cleaners who are potentially handling that waste. Another area that did come up in a previous conversation is a lot of staff pick up litter as they walk around sites. This is potentially contaminated waste. You may need to think about engaging with your staff and volunteers and managing new strategies for litter picking and managing those waste streams, which wouldn't have been there before. Lifts, we're going to move on to the last couple of minutes. So some of you may or may not have lifts. The image here is maybe slightly over the top. I'm not suggesting you have big signage like this. I think where possible, if you've got lifts, it's encouraging people to use other routes, fundamentally. Is the biggest measure here. If you do have them, maintain social distancing. For a lot of lifts, that means going to be limiting a lift journey to either one individual or one group who are attending site together, for example, a family group. You're going to need regular cleaning those touch points on lifts. I know in office environments, a lot of people, maybe something to think about your staff, they're giving out kind of styluses. These like kind of just pieces of plastic basically, or even using a pen. So when they're pressing lift buttons, they're using a piece of plastic that can be decontaminated rather than issuing people touching buttons all the time. But lifts have to be used. Some people are limiting lift use to only people with particular accessibility needs or those with push chairs. Think very carefully around your messaging here. And one thing I'd always say is, with all these, a significant number of disabilities aren't visible. So you've got to think about how that's managed and potential scope for conflict there as well, between visitors and between staff and visitors as well. So health HSE here, again, good hygiene, reiteration here, set clear cleaning guidance for cleaning toilets and showers and those high contact points particularly, and don't forget staff and back of house areas. Good signage, but not too much signage. Keep it clear, keep it simple. There's some great examples out there, and be consistent in your signage around the site as well. So people can, they're almost reminded just by seeing the colour, the branding as they go through. So a few case studies. There's Kew Gardens, and they're just going out there and they're saying that actually they're going to be closing some of their toilets. That you may need to wait while they manage enough space. So just managing expectations. And a number of sites are reopening, and for some places that aren't reopening their toilets, they're being very clear on their social media feeds. On others, don't underestimate how important knowledge about the toilets being open is to visitors coming to site. It's really, really important, and it's something you need to be communicating quite widely. So this final piece of the National Museum Directors Council, again, they talk about toilets and lifts. It talks about everything. Just set clear guidance. And they suggest restricting use of lifts to those with mobility issues and pushchairs, but you just need to think about how you're going to manage and message that is really important. Again, but also we're encouraging people to move away from lifts, as I said, but if that means people are on stairs, are you potentially creating another unsocially distant space by forcing everybody through those routes, and you may need one-way routes through stairs. So think about at any point, whether that's your one-way planning or your moving people to another area may create pinch points, so you can't underestimate that. Manage queues outdoors. So one of the areas is that if you have the luxury to do that, to kind of keep people queuing outdoors. We talked about last time sustainability of solutions. Will that still work if restrictions are in place in mid-February? Think about that in terms of your planning. And I'm going to take a breath. We've got a 5-minute break there. We're about on schedule. We've gone through an awful lot, but hopefully the sense you've got, and we've deliberately gone through and taken guidance from a number of sources to say that there is really good information out there. And we're trying to kind of flavour this with case studies. If nothing else, be reassured that everyone else is grappling with the same challenges, and you can be quite pragmatic in those. So I'm going to stop talking. We've got a 5-minute break now. I'm making it just about 1 minute past 11. So if we can come back not long after 5 past, that's time to go and make a cup of tea. But I'll be here if anybody's got any questions or wants to put on the chat. But otherwise, I'll see you all in 5 minutes. So thanks for your time, everyone. Okay, we're going to get going again now. We're just gone 6 minutes past. So apologies if some of you are still running back from getting a cup of tea, but hopefully you're all comfortable again. We're going to the last session now. So we're going to cover some key topics around cleaning, cafes and shops, outdoor areas, moving into a number of areas where the guidance isn't so clear. So we're going to be talking about some of the examples and just some of the key considerations that you need to be thinking about. And then importantly, as I've probably said many times during this training, about communication strategies with visitors and staff, and looking at some of the solutions there. So we're going to start off, we're looking at some more service areas in focus. Again, please do use the chat function. Kay's sharing some really good information there. And by the way, when you do put up examples, it's really useful to hear. Oh, so if I just go to the right place. Cleaning regimes. So again, the other data is just coming back to around cleanliness. So this is what makes visitors feel more comfortable about being on site. So in fact, visibility of hand sanitizer at entrance and around site. I think is really important. Staff visibility of cleaning surfaces, notices on site reassuring visitors about cleaning. So a large part of this, when it comes to cleaning from the visitors, is they want to have confidence that the cleaning is being done. So you think about how you can do this. We talked in the last session about actually how traditionally cleaners, we try to keep them out of the way. We don't want to kind of impact on the visitor experience. We try and manage cleaner regimes so they're not available. But now visitors are saying they actually can be greatly reassured by seeing a cleaner there, cleaning door handles, cleaning balustrades. So think about that. And also as well, it's that appreciation for some of our support staff who are working with us and our volunteers who undertake these tasks, that actually cleaning is one of the things we didn't want to think about previously, but now it's one of the top priorities for visitors. Is actually they want to see a cleaner as much as they want to see a member of front of house staff or anybody else. So make your cleaning visible is a really good way to reassure your visitors. And don't be afraid if you need to be cleaning high contact areas or high frequency occupation areas. that you can be sending cleaners in there. But also just don't forget about those cleaners equally need to socially distance as well. So you need to think about cleaning regimes. And I appreciate for some of you, it may be that your volunteers and staff are doing some of the cleaning as well. So you need to make sure that if they are changing how they operate and they are cleaning in a different way and potentially dealing with contaminated waste, as we talked about before the break, you may need to undertake some training for those. And there's some really good guidance out there around cleaning methodologies. So cleaning before reopening. So this is just some of the broader guidance that's out there, just kind of putting some of this together. Opening windows and doors to increase ventilation. Do your ventilation systems need to be adjusted? So the advice from Public Health England is to increase fresh air flows. So depending on your site, that might mean opening windows. That might mean if you have a mechanical ventilation system, increasing airflow. There is a lot of debate and discussion going on at the moment, because don't forget, you may be trying to maintain environmental conditions for historic fabric or for collections. Therefore, bringing in large amounts of fresh air could equally bring in pests, pollutants, may impact the actual environmental conditions. There isn't a clean resolution to this. I'm helping to facilitate some conversations with this. So CIBSE, the Charles Institute of Building Services, working with them to try and come out with some museum-specific environment guidance that we're looking at the moment, because it's not very clear. But I would say Public Health England said increased ventilation. Probably fine in areas where there's no historic fabric or collections. And if there are, just think very carefully before doing this, because you may fix one problem around COVID or be supporting that, but you may be creating longer term issues for your collection as well. So keeping workplace clean. Frequent cleaner services and areas between use, particularly when you've got staff and volunteers. Potentially think about providing them with cleaning materials to give them the opportunity, if for example, if they're at a static workstation. Behaviours that we talked about before, but will be required more than ever. You might not have the opportunity to have multiple staff working with multiple workstations. If they have to use the same workstation, think about cleaning regimes for cleaning particularly high contact points, keyboards, telephones, any other equipment like that is going to be a high contact and a high risk area. Frequent cleaning of objects and surfaces that are touched regularly. Caveat being, just think about historic fabric, and we'll come on to that one slightly later. Providing hand sanitizer in multiple locations. One is it's about allowing your visitors to kind of decontaminate themselves effectively through hand washing, but another one, it's a real kind of a clear message around the fact that you are thinking about decontamination of the site, and it's another great reassurance. Use signs and posters to build awareness of good hand washing. As I advocated previously, to my mind, I think keep it simple, make it communicated to multiple users. There was the World Health Organization one, which is really detailed, but that's a lot of information, and somebody is not going to read that when they're going for a toilet visit. A simple diagram, one image is more likely to be incorporated and thought about. Provide more waste facilities and team bins more frequently. Again, waste can potentially be contaminated if somebody's touched it. So you need to make sure that any waste that's being handled is being handled in the right way and disposed of in the right way as well. So this one here is on cleaning historic materials and services. So Historic England have got some guidance on this. As much with this is we probably could have a whole webinar on this one, but I just want to make it really clear that a lot of you work in historic buildings and properties, and equally this goes for collections that may particularly large collection objects that may have the opportunity to be touched. Is to think about how you clean these. Rather than I'm not necessarily going to go through and say here are cleaning regimes for historic fabrics. Again, that has to be risk assessed. But what I would say is there's guidance out there, particularly on historic services. Fundamentally, they're saying it's about kind of close affected rooms for 72 hours before attempting to clean. These, I think they're talking about particularly when they're believed to be contaminated rather than regular cleaning. But obviously with any of these, just think about the materials you're using, the chemicals that you're using, and that cleaning materials are the right ones. And ultimately work with your collection care, conservation colleagues and ensure that those are being considered. But there's some advice out there, and Historic England is a really good starting point for just thinking about this. So just don't forget about historic fabric. So that was a real canter through cleaning. What I would say is, I know a number of people say, well, what is the required frequency? Things like toilet cleaning. Again, it's about your risk assessment locally. So some institutions we're seeing doing a deep clean once a day and then kind of frequent hourly cleaning. Some are closing their facilities and doing a deep clean on multiple occasions during the day. The guidance isn't specific. There's not one that says when a toilet has been used X number of times, this is how you need to clean it. It doesn't exist. However, obviously, all of the guidance is that you need to be keeping your toilet facilities clean and working within the capabilities of your own organisation. So I think work with whoever's responsible for cleaning. Maybe that's a contractor. If you are working with an external contractor, they should have expertise and that they can bring to the site. Think about the chemicals they're using and the processes and how they're approaching cleaning of the toilets, and come up with a frequency that you think, because equally it may be in terms of how often your toilets are used. Where possible, to avoid conflict, as I said, put cleaning regimes up in a clear place within the toilets so people can see that the toilets are being cleaned on a regular basis. Also, you're pre-answering any questions that visitors may have. You can say, look, here we've stated what our cleaning regime is for the toilets. And as with all of these measures, you put in place a mechanism that you feel comfortable with and you feel that you're able to justify. But it is an area, cleaning particularly, that could come with a high price tag in terms of resourcing. And it may be one of the real limiters about reopening for a number of institutions. So just be pragmatic, but ultimately be comfortable with whatever measures you're putting in place. So cafes and shops. Okay, this is quite an interesting one because this is where we cross over into guidance that also looks for other areas. They are also spaces that have reopened in other settings. So visitor expectations are potentially set by how they're experiencing them elsewhere. Shops have been open, particularly food shops, throughout lockdown. People are used to some of the measures that are coming into place there. But even in the space of the last 48 hours, face coverings in shops, for example, has come through as a piece of guidance. And we're already seeing how these are changing. So cafes and shops. One of the big strategies that we're seeing probably more broadly than any other before we start on this is a number of sites are just offering takeaway only while they're still figuring out how they get capacities working to provide some kind of offer, and equally to have some kind of revenue stream. They're offering takeaway services. This works quite well. We're in the middle of summer in theory at the moment, so people are more likely and ready to use outdoor spaces. Some are being fairly entrepreneurial. If they have a cafe offering, they're offering kind of picnic boxes and thinking more about that picnic offering and providing marked out spaces and areas and clearly signposting those to the visitors. And I think it was Hever Castle, I saw a case study, and they were providing picnic boxes, and then they were kind of cutting grass and having larger picnic areas than they would have normally had, and encouraging people to use those. So there are opportunities of doing that. How sustainable that is as we move into a kind of what is quite a grey and wet British summer and then into autumn and winter, we need to be thinking about. But I know cafes and shops are an area that people are particularly concerned about. Also with cafes, it's an area where visitors already have, I wouldn't say, but they have a heightened awareness around hygiene, and there are various measures that come into place on that. So it's prudent, and the data is showing that this is an area where visitors have the most anxiety about returning to site. So what can you do? Well, effectively reduce capacity within the spaces, removing chairs and tables. Again, I think I mentioned before, there's a European museum and they had mannequins dressed in costume, and I've seen some with like cutouts filling those spaces and those chairs to try and create an environment that didn't feel quite so empty and quite so sterile. Again, using the particularly some of the humour, some of the welcoming nature of their institution to make that environment feel a bit less sanitised. Discourage queuing indoors, encouraging people to queue outside. Again, this may be slightly weather dependent. You may be thinking about this in terms of your business model. Providing only disposable condiments. So this is something I think is really interesting. I've got quite a passion for sustainability in the museum environment, and we've done great leaps and bounds in kind of recent years, particularly around removing disposables, reusable coffee cups, all these areas. We seem to be taking a step backwards in response to COVID, so think about what the opportunities are there. A number of coffee chains are accepting reusable coffee cups again, so they're just thinking about how they're having to manage and handle something that's potentially a contaminated object from a member of the public. And again, I think those are scenarios where they have potentially more staff and they can segregate the workflow around kind of coffee, providing coffees in reusable cups. But you do need to think about this. And also, if you are not using disposable condiments or cutlery or anything else, just decontamination, cleaning of those as well. Something to think about. So another one we're seeing in several environments is obviously minimizing contact using screens, particularly in front of where staff come into direct contact, or if there are takeaway offers. So perspex screens are a commonly used method that we're seeing elsewhere. But as I say, we're not seeing many cafes and restaurants opening up in museums yet, but they are beginning to now. So there'll be more information coming through on these in coming days. So here's just some examples. So the Royal Academy and Tech Museum are opening their cafes, but the high proportion are saying they're only opening for takeaway at this point, but we are seeing that changing over time. With shops, there's a couple of strategies we see coming in, so I can't remember if that's on the next slide or not, where shops are only offering a kind of a counter service for their shop, rather than actually allowing people to come in and browse as a way to kind of still have the shops open. It's something that's worth thinking about. As with cafes and other areas and retail environments, you don't only need to look at the museum-specific guidance on this. There is guidance that applies to other sectors. This is from the Food Standards Agency, and this is their broad generic guidance. And it's just something that's just worth thinking about when you're thinking about reopening your cafe, about making sure you're meeting the basic guidance. So thorough cleaning, unsurprisingly, this is the kind of one of the themes that comes through all of this. Clean and disinfection, comply with the general rules for food hygiene. So again, with all of these, you can't forget that there are basics in place around food hygiene, around other measures that need to be maintained throughout this. And what they're saying is if you've actually got a cafe, you should have, they reference it as a food safety management system. But a lot of risks around contamination, around staff protection should have been thought about even ahead of COVID. So where possible, don't reinvent the wheel. Go back and visit those risk assessments, the work you've already done, and look about how those measures and mitigations can be adapted and evolved to suit COVID. PPE, so again, this is what the Food Standards Agency is saying, for the protection of workers and prevent contamination of food. The current situation doesn't change that. And you need to make sure that obviously if you're trying to prevent contamination, you should have already been thinking about that previously. It may be enhanced now either to mitigate particular risks that you see around COVID transmission, or just for visitor comfort and their comfort in being able to visit those sites. So a really good one, probably the ones I'd pick out on this one here. This is from the Food Standards Agency on gloves. The best way in which food handlers can maintain good personal hygiene is by frequently washing their hands. Gloves can be used as an aid to good food hygiene practice, but should be considered as a substitute for a thorough regime of hand washing. For me, this is a really important one. I think it goes into other areas. And for those of you who, as I do, kind of visit some cafes, restaurants, you see people wearing gloves, but they are potentially handling cash with that and handling food. And actually, clean, good hand washing would be a far better measure for minimizing contamination. So even just because you can wear gloves, and this in a cafe setting or in any others, doesn't mean you essentially should or have to. So I would think very carefully about this in terms of for gloves as a solution to this, because if you're wearing gloves but you're touching multiple contact points, that could be a real challenge. So the next one, personal protective equipment. We've already talked about this one. It doesn't change the requirements. We mentioned gloves. Face masks, protect high-risk foods. Again, so this is often the case where these have been risk assessed already, and it would be around wearing face protection to avoid contamination, but there may be, you may risk assess and think you need these in place. And social distancing. So often cafes are in incredibly confined spaces, and actually footprint has been maximised to give visitors the most amount of space, but not necessarily the staff. So really think about those working conditions for staff working in a cafe area. It's not uncommon to have several members of staff behind a counter selling coffees, cakes, teas. Are there opportunities to minimise the risk of transmission? Probably in those high contact areas, it's going to be about shifts and bubbling of staff and putting those measures in place, and good practice around hand washing, where physical distancing in that confined area just won't be possible. So because you can't physically distance, the guidance is saying that it doesn't mean you can't operate. It just means you need to risk assess and think about what other measures you can put in place to minimise the risk to the staff in those areas. Retail guidance. This is some of the high-level guidance that's come out about minimising contact. So this goes across all settings, but I think applies to retail environments in museums as well. Again, this is available on the government website. I'm sure Kay's she's been on the ball here in terms of getting all these links across to you, so you've got full access here. So effectively, defining the number of customers that can reasonably be allowed 2 meters social distancing. So the same as your museum setting. walk into those spaces, risk assess, think about how many people you can get into that area. Can you have people in, and are there other ways to manage it in terms of walking routes around the space? Or it may be a one-in, one-out policy if you've got a very small areas. So by overall limiting the number of customers that you've got in that retail environment, in that shop. Encourage customers to use hand sanitizer and hand washing facilities. So you may be thinking about providing them, and particularly even just dedicated to that shop. Assume that a shop might be a really high contact point with people picking up objects. Providing hand sanitizer in that area is really important. So I was at a shop yesterday where they're actually a large high street shop with a piece of fruit as its branding that sells computers, and they were doing temperature checks on entering the site, and you had to wear a face mask as you walked into the shop, and you had to wash your hands with hand sanitizer. So what I'm saying is, I'm not expecting that you necessarily have to do this, but there are some trends in retail that we can see that are potentially will be rolled out more widely, or that visitors will have an expectation if they come to a site like yours, then we're thinking about. So keep an eye on the retail environment, I think, just for visitor expectation, if nothing else. Encourage customers to avoid handling products. So this is a bit of a soft touch bit, but just pointing out the risks and just saying, I've seen signage in some shops saying, can you just limit, if it's only when you're really serious about an object, you don't just go through and handle every object that you kind of, you only handle objects that you're very committed to buying. Again, this will have an impact on the retail environment. You want people to come in to browse. It may be a really important revenue for your revenue stream for your site. So you need to think about messaging, managing this messaging really carefully. Suspending or reducing customer services that cannot be undertaken. Just maybe you have to change the shop model. Maybe you have to move to a counter model for your shop, and visitors come and they request that objects go and get collected for them. Very difficult one, and one that you really need to think about when opening the retail offer. Encouraging customers to shop alone. Well, it depends how they visited the site, I guess. You don't want parents coming in and leaving children outside of your museum shop, potentially posing risks. Where possible, this word encourage is one that you're going to see a lot. It's not saying you have to or you shall, it is encourage. Reminding customers of company children they're responsible for supervising them. Again, this is probably going to go for the whole museum setting. Again, be very mindful of that messaging. I think there's a potential area for conflict there, but equally it's an important one. So really do think about how you manage that. And then also, the point here, 8, be flexible. Look at how people use your shops, use your spaces, and then you may implement measures that need to change if people start using it in a different way, and just be flexible. Don't undertake major fabric interventions that cost a lot of money. Look to put interventions that can change and can be flexible in terms of how people want to use the space. So yeah, don't forget disabled shoppers. Don't forget those particular access needs. Don't create an environment that is not accessible to everybody. And some of these are more general, so they can obviously talk about parking and outside queuing where possible. But just think about, you may have to have a queuing system in place for your shop. And then you also be mindful that when you create a queuing system, you don't create queues and then create density somewhere else that may create a problem in its own right. And also think about, if you're in a very confined space, some of you may have neighbours, other organisations, you may be in a shared building, you may be in council premises with other people around you. Think about how your measures may impact on those other users, other shops, other retail units, other offices, some of you in shared buildings completely. And where you are in those environments, do look to collaborate with those groups where possible, and again, create a consistent messaging around any of the measures that you're putting in place. So what with your local authority, your landlords, some of you are only in as tenants. So your landlords may have particular views on this. I think that's really important. They may have strategies they're looking to implement. Make sure you engage fairly on. And if you have tenants yourselves, I don't know if any of you do, but really think about making sure you engage with them and communicate about how you expect them or would like to work with them to operate in these spaces. So this is available online. I won't go through all of these bullet points. Yeah, we can go through that. So again, here's one. Again, the case study, I think I mentioned it already, Royal Academy of Arts. And they're explaining even on their website what their shop's going to be like. They're saying here they can keep distance from others, these follow signs. They're just really encouraging. And the final point, they don't forget to enjoy yourself. I probably said, I'm the one here going, don't do this, do that. Make sure there's some enjoyment, and look at the opportunities here for making sure that this doesn't become so burdensome. We're going to be the ones with the headaches, thinking about how we put these measures into place, but we need to make sure that when they come out the other end, they are as user-friendly and as welcoming as they possibly can be. So we're going to move on to outdoor areas now. which I know a number of you will have, having seen the list here. Outdoor areas, so in theory, what we're talking about is a much lower risk. From the Alva data we saw earlier, people are far less concerned about outdoor areas where there's access to significant fresh air, and this is the the guidance that's come from central government, is that they are lower risk. However, they do still present some of their own challenges, and we're going to talk about some of those now. So transport is a key one and a key consideration for a lot of you in terms of planning, and sites are kind of introducing specific measures regarding transport. Stonehenge is a site that actually they have a shuttle bus on site, so they're again similar to the lift strategy, that they're prioritising for those with particular requirements. Knowing the team down there, I think what they're trying to do is, again, they're relying on visitors to manage this. They're relying on the goodwill of the visitors for people to be honest, to avoid conflict, and it's actually people being honest about what they're doing, and then choosing to use it if they can. And again, if they've got the shuttle bus, not forgetting that they're required to wear a face covering. So effectively, they're treating their shuttle bus as public transport, and the guidance is that you need to wear a face covering on public transport. So don't forget, if any of you do have these services on your site, you need to think about that as well. Some sites are offering free parking to reduce use of public transport. So in terms of your reopening planning, depending on where you're located, it may be free parking. You might have the luxury of doing this. Think about your cycle parking and other routes to get into site. It might just be as simple as really re-emphasizing the alternative routes that people can use to get to site that avoid using public transport. Again, this is, in terms of our sustainability piece, this is quite counter to what we've all been working on for a recent number of years, where we've been encouraging people to get out of their cars and to use public transport. However, there may be a short-term impact here where we look to encourage people, but equally that encouragement could be towards making people aware that actually there are certain routes that are within walking distance, that they can come and park their bikes, that there are other ways to get to site. But it's something that really needs to be thought about. So again, National Trust saying some car parks are remaining closed because they need staff to manage them. You might not be able to this could become a management issue around having staff while they're on furloughs and they're reopening at the moment. So you may not be able to open all car parks at this point. And again, I think it's flagging this one again for the Alva data about how you feel about visiting each of these types of transport, using these types of transport to visit a visitor attraction. And people kind of saying it's just worth bearing in mind in terms of your planning. I know we talked about reopening, that a lot of people would be anxious. 50% of people, if you're in an urban area that's got reliant on underground or metro trains or on public buses, overground trains, a significant portion of people would be very anxious about using those. So I know this has been a big concern about a lot of institutions reopening. It's about how comfortable people are about using them. There's probably only so much you can do, but like I said, the way around this is to advertise alternate routes for people to get to site. If you have car parking, if you have other forms of transport, and ultimately just making your people reassured that they're going to be safe on your site. If you are working in a local area and if there is guidance available from your local bus provider, from your local train provider, potentially think about linking through to that data as well, that if you're acknowledging that people will be using public transport, you could link through on your webpage and say, by the way, if you want to see how X train company is managing the risk around coronavirus, you can put that on there. So you want to make it as easy as possible for your visitors to feel comfortable about planning their visit to your site. Play area is an interesting one. So again, from our data that we've seen around the UK, so play areas, particularly outdoor play areas, generally as a rule have remained closed. We've seen some that are reopening. And here's some of the guidance from the government around reopening play areas. So up until recently, play areas in any setting outdoor play areas were not allowed to be opened, but they are allowed to be opened now. So in your local parks, you would see that the play areas may very well be reopened now. But these have always been a high-risk environment because they're high contact points, a number of children. So again, some of the advice coming from government to think around this about if you are going to reopen those play areas, what to think about. So signs to communicate maximum number of users at one time. Again, what we're saying here is it's going to be about guidance. It's going to be about working with your visitors and trusting them to do the right thing. And again, request, we're not talking about demanding here. It's requesting that those using the play area only have one family member accompany a child. So actually remember, the risk may actually be from large groups of adults standing around in close proximity while their children all play together is actually one of the high contamination risks. So think about that as well. Obviously, safety and welfare needs to come at the top of any list of when prioritising reopening. So you've got to make sure they're safe spaces and that you're not encouraging any behaviours that wouldn't make the space. limiting the limited number of seats on equipment, roundabouts. As you saw with kind of toilets and trains, like kind of cordoning off seats or kind of taking swings out of action, just creating that physical distancing. Thinking about cleaning regimes. If you have the resources, think about queues, waiting areas, having those managed if you can. If you can't, maybe that's just relying on the goodwill of your visitors and having signage and saying, if you've got a small play area, that we're limiting this to X number of children at any one point in time, and then trusting your visitors to do the right thing and limit those. Potentially, maybe you haven't done previously, consider bringing your play areas into cleaning regimes, particularly the high contact points. I'm sure that would be a great reassurance, particularly to those parents with children, to see that there was somebody there kind of cleaning some of the surfaces. So again, this is to my last point there, developing cleaning regimes for high contact areas. And they're making suggestions here. Semi-enclosed playhouses, huts for small children, exercise bars, entry and exit points such as gates. So just, it's not necessarily about cleaning the entire playground, but it is, again, as everywhere else, it's risk assessing and just not forgetting your playgrounds and outdoor areas. And again, as I said before, if your playground isn't going to be open, advertise it, let parents know before they come onto site, particularly if it's one of your popular areas. It may be something that people are expecting when they come for a site visit, so just be very clear with them. And equally as well, it may be about phase reopening. If there's a piece of equipment that you don't feel that you can safely reopen, then you need to be thinking about that and potentially advertising, but you could close some of those areas off. You could close pieces of equipment off if you weren't comfortable that you could open those. But rather than closing down the entire play area, it may just be putting certain pieces of equipment out of action. Refuse areas and bins. So don't forget, there's going to be probably a relatively high dwell time in these areas. There could be potential for quite a lot of litter. Again, you want to avoid your staff having to pick up, or other members of the public pick up contaminated waste. Make sure there's ample provision of bins so that your visitors can get rid of their waste where possible. So we kind of cantered through that one. Again, I wanted to spend a bit of time on this one because it's a theme that we've talked about a lot, and it's about communication strategies for visitors and staff. So all of these measures, hopefully as you've seen up to now, there's a lot of commonality. It's about risk assessment. It's about getting the basics right. But ultimately, what we're really challenged with at the moment is there's high levels of anxiety across many areas of the population, of the workforce, of our visitors. They have concerns about returning to sites, whether they work there or they're just visiting. And we need to think about how we can communicate with them in a way that engages with them, that makes them feel comfortable, and allows us to kind of make sure we're opening happy sites that are enjoyable and engaging to work in and to visit as well. So we're going to look at these now. Here's some guidance that actually just came from ICOM, and I think it's just quite a useful kind of starting point with some of these. Number one, listen to your staff. I know it's going to get stating the obvious, but I'm quite happy to sit here and state the obvious. Is understand what your staff may be going through, or may have even gone through during lockdown. If they've gone through furlough, they may have anxieties. They may have been directly impacted by COVID themselves, either family members or themselves. They may have really high levels of anxiety. So really think about these. And I know that a number of institutions, as well as applying risk assessments generally to the organisation, are also working with members of staff and volunteers to do local risk assessments, individual risk assessments, and just looking for those opportunities as line managers to engage with their staff to allow them to express their anxieties. And through this, you will learn an awful lot about how you need to reopen your site, about what the staff are worried about, and by their own knowledge as well, they'll have good insight into what the visitors will be anxious about as well. Be aware that you may not know all of your staff members' specific situations. You may not be able to fully understand all these anxieties, but you just need to understand that they will be there, and that you may need to respond to them, and that where possible, try not to impose just generic solutions, although there are always going to be some. Where work with individual staff members, particularly those who have high levels of anxiety about returning. Because if we strip this back as well, if you have staff with high levels of anxiety, you think about the customer experience piece and their engagement. There's going to be an underlying tone there that may impact that whole customer experience piece. So you want to look after your staff first of all, make them comfortable. In terms of your reopening planning, staff engagement, where possible, I understand you may have staff on furlough, so it's difficult, but that may come into your reopening planning. You may need to allow time to engage with your staff when they return for furlough before you reopen. This is something just to think about. One of the real challenges, and I've seen happen a couple of places, which I don't think is ideal, is the reopening planning, and they bring staff off furlough pretty much immediately at the point they plan to reopen. And those staff haven't got an opportunity to engage, to become comfortable. I think in terms of your reopening planning, I would advocate where possible allowing time for that. Obviously, you are allowed some limited engagement with during furlough, but make sure you understand all of those, your limitations. I'm sure you fully understand those if you have got staff who are on furloughs. Equally with volunteers, make sure you engage with them, make sure they feel comfortable. Don't just assume, particularly with your volunteer workforce, that everybody's going to want to come back on day one. And if they don't, I'd encourage you to engage with them and understand what those challenges are, and then look to where you can mitigate those and work with them, but equally underneath it all, understand those anxieties you go through. For your staff, just the final point there, just provide some dedicated time, space. That can be remote, that can be Zoom, that can be a telephone call. Just give them an opportunity to feedback in whatever way you feel you're best resourced to do that. So communicating with staff, share reputable sources of information and advice. Again, this is probably a really important one. Reputable advice, there's an awful lot of content going around on social media, on the internet, even through media channels. Be very mindful about sharing advice and guidance that hasn't come from reputable sources. You are potentially exposing yourself to a great deal of risk if you share advice that is incorrect or unfounded. Where possible, Public Health England, obviously I think you're all based in England, so that would be where you get most of your advice from. Central government websites, organisations such as AIM and Museums Association and others, where there is reputable, proven advice that is based on central government guidance, is what you need to be sharing with your staff. Be very mindful about sharing news stories, even if it appears relevant, and a study has been done on the use of PPE in environments by a scientist in northern Italy. That may be very well and interesting, but be careful about how you would share and communicate that with what we're doing. Again, I said before, consider the mental health impacts. So the Mental Health Foundation is just one of many resources. I'm just putting this up there to kind of signpost you towards one that talks about particularly around your staff and your workers, and about steps you might take to engage with them and to consider their mental health, which is something I think we should do all the time, but I think particularly in a period of high anxiety and significant difficulty, it's something that we should really think very carefully around. So anxiety, so we're talking here around visitors particularly, but I think this goes to the staff. Just reiterating the points, come back to this kind of data. You can equally source this data yourself, and we'll talk about this, a number of people engaging with their visitors before coming back to site, but figure out what everyone's actually worried about, because that's really going to help you, one, in your planning, but two, in terms of your engagement. And I think in terms of that, often toilets are the things that get talked about at the bottom of a website. Actually, do you know what this data is showing us? That you should be talking about the toilets fairly early on in terms of any engagement with your visitors. You need to choose that messaging, and that people are getting slightly more anxious about some of these areas as time goes on as well. So communicating on change with your future visitors. So even if you haven't opened, it doesn't mean you can't be engaging with your visitors. And this can be a really powerful tool in your reopening planning. So here's an example here from National Museums Liverpool, who I think actually are about to reopen fairly soon. But they released, this is back in May, and they released a survey that went out, and they pushed it on social media. They used various mailing lists that they had for membership, and it was a fairly simple poll. You can use tools such, I think there's tools such as SurveyMonkey, which you can set up online polls for free, and there's other platforms are available as well. And they were asking questions that basically said, if you were going to return to site, so here's some example questions. How anxious do you feel about visiting National Museum venues after they reopen? If an exhibition has an interactive element, such as touchscreens or allows handling of exhibits, would you consider visiting? And then they go on to talk about specific measures. So you can really use this as an opportunity to test and engage. And it's twofold. One, you'll get some great information from your visitors about what makes them feel comfortable and about what measures will work and won't work with your visitors. But also, I think probably more powerfully, it's showing your visitors that you're thinking about this. You're engaging with them before they return to site. And particularly if they're very keen to come back, and if they're one that they have direct contact with you via social media feeds or mailing lists, that they'll go, oh, they're thinking about this, they're planning. There's a level of reassurance that you're going to start to build up, that you guys haven't just closed down, everyone's gone home for 3 months and then reopened the doors again, that you are actually spending a lot of time doing this. So I'd really encourage early engagement with your staff and visitors wherever possible. And I think these polls are potentially a good way to do it. This is National Museums Liverpool. If you go onto social media, various other sites, there are a lot out there. Again, as with all of these, if you know of any good ones, then please do put them into the chat function, and we'd be keen to share those as well. So government advice, we won't get into too much detail. Again, where there is government advice, you may look to share this, particularly with your staff. So this is this has been in use through lockdown as just the very basic kind of steps to COVID compliance. And this, for example, is something that you can download this from the Public Health England. I think I haven't got the link to hand. Maybe Kay will find that one. I think it's definitely available on the government website on their main COVID advice. And this is something that you could print. You could go through and ensure that you are implementing all of these, and then sign up, put them on notice boards. Again, just measures of reassurance that you can go through with your staff, and particularly in back of house areas, to give them confidence that this is the front end of your planning. These are the high level summaries of probably what is going to be some quite detailed planning going on behind the scenes. So we talked before, this is coming fairly recently, but it's been developed during lockdown with a number of organisations involved. This is the Kite Mark accreditation standard. So this is kind of involving Visit England. I know Alva involved in this and others. Now, this is a kite mark system that goes across all visitor attractions. So this is, I think, anything from kind of B&Bs and hotels through to amusement parks and various others. It's a opportunity. It's a fairly simple assessment to do. They think it's take about 20 or 30 minutes. Basically, you go through and it's a series of questions, a checklist to say, here are the measures that we've done, and you sign up and say you've done all of the measures that are in there, and that aligns to government guidance. And then what that gives you is the opportunity for this big logo on the right to then utilize this on site and on social media and on your website to publicize that you are what we're saying good to go. And the idea behind this being that this is going to be a recognized symbol and standard, and this will give visitors moving between various different settings a degree of comfort that that particular site has undertaken to adhere to all key government guidance. And again, it's another real kind of key piece of reassurance. And then you need to think about how that could be used with your visitors to potentially communicate to them before they attend site. And for example, here's just a couple, even just this morning, I went and got these about how museums are using these to put up on these from their websites. And these are kind of very prominent that they're putting up there that on their websites, on their social media feeds, as a way to really make visitors feel comfortable. So again, this is a recognised standard that can go out there. It's not massively cumbersome to do. It's fairly new in, so we haven't got much data back yet in terms of kind of what visitor perceptions are of this, but I think surveys are starting to be done. My personal view is I don't think this can hurt at the moment. I think any opportunities to engage in wider standard setting are quite useful. Kay's can handily put on the link on the web feed to that on the chat function. So another real key tool, and as we're getting towards the end of the session, I'm just watching the clock at the moment, we've got a few minutes left, is about reopening videos. So these have been used, and I think there's two opportunities here for you. Maybe you have the resources to create your own reopening video. There's platforms that you can create videos that don't actually involve video, but are just effectively slideshows. And there's some quite good tools online that you can use for creating those. However, if you had the opportunity to create a video, this is a really good way to get a lot of comfort across your visitors and give them a sense of what the site will be like. I'll just show you this Royal Air Force one shortly. The other thing I would say, and encourage you when you're watching this video, is there a great opportunity for you as museum professionals to see what everybody else is doing. One of the reasons I'm going to show you this RAF museum one is I'm just going to be talking while I try and line this video up and hopefully get the sound working. Is I really particularly like this one, and maybe it's not the flashiest one that I've seen up, but they've been really good on, to my mind, managing some of that playfulness, some of that brand identity. They've really tailored it to them, and I'll share this now, and hopefully you might see what I'm thinking on this one. So hopefully this works. Can you see a YouTube screen at the moment? Yep.
this virus. But now we're allowed to surface from our bunkers. And I'm pleased to say that the top brass has given the green light to reopen both RAF museums at Cosford and London for you and your family. Now, there'll be a few extra protocols in place since we were last up and at it. We can't have too many of you or your squadron coming into land at the same time. So, you'll have to check in online and book a time of arrival in advance. And don't out for all the family with wide open spaces. We're easy to get to with plenty of car parking. Our restaurants are open for takeaway food and our shops are taking contactless payment. And if you're unsure about anything, don't get in a flap. Our ground crew will direct you from a safe distance. Piece of cake. No mission is complete without a debrief. Please provide feedback after your visit so that nothing slips under our radar. Admission is free, and I'll freely admit, we've missed you. We can't wait to see you, so go ahead, book your visit today. Chocks away.
So, I thought quite a lot of shit, and as I said before, almost as we're getting towards the end of the training course, I just want to kind of put some of that playfulness back into this, and just a reminder that this feels very heavy, and I know we're all feeling a real burden and responsibility to get this right, but there are various ways we can approach this, and I think that you need to look at the strengths of your own organisation, about what makes you unique, and try and apply all of those processes, all that thinking into this as well. Case comment, they say it's a family-friendly video as well, that's quite engaging for younger people. I think also as well that the good videos I've seen like this one, if you watch that, I think you automatically would feel a lot more comfortable about visiting that site, having seen that. You've got a sense of what it would feel like inside. You got a sense of some of the measures in there. You notice as well, they really emphasize some of the key points around that they've got a lot of outdoor space. They saw as being a real positive and something that visitors would benefit from. They mentioned about the car parking. So they've got an awful lot of messaging across in that. And as I said previously, the research at the moment is showing that about 95% of visitors are doing online research and visiting the websites and information about the sites before they visit, which is a far higher proportion than they ever would have done before. So people are going and looking at this data, particularly at this time. But if you can't, that's a fairly kind of high spec, costly video potentially to make. I don't think it was too expensive, but it was reasonable cost. There's other ways you can do this. It doesn't have to be a video. It can be through images. Again, I've seen some great feeds on social media, on Twitter, where they've just done a series of photos with commentary in one single thread on social media, and they go, this is what the toilets will look like, and here's the car park, and having all that information available on your website. So there's more than one way to get this across. So, and like I said, if you go to some of these videos, I think that's a really useful way to think about getting some additional information from those sites that are up there. So there's lots out there. I just particularly like the RF Museum one because it was quite important. So before visitors attend sites, so think about signage. So before they even enter the building, is there an opportunity to get that information across to them, to set the tone? I quite like this one from the National Memorial Arboretum. It's very consistent signage right the way through, quite simple messaging, and just again that kind of respect, protect, enjoy. Just kind of apply yourselves in the right way, but still enjoy your visit. Because if you sanitize it too much, then you're going to take away the desire for people to want to enjoy that space and come again potentially. Accessible signage. So I think Kay's already kind of put up there's going to be the Museum DCN network going to be running a specific event on this one, but just make sure you follow. These are the basic principles for signage, regardless of COVID relations. So I'm just these are little prompts for you. This is government guidance on accessible formats. Write in plain language, make it concise as possible, designed to be as legible as possible. Again, say minimum 14-point text size. These are basic principles, but what I'm saying is don't forget to do these. I'm sure you do these all the time, but just make sure now's a chance to apply these and do them in a good way as well. And that makes it as accessible for as many of your visitors as possible. So the Disability Collaborative Network, the event, they've got a great website. So I'd encourage you to go to their website. And this is some of the links to some of the guidance that they've set out. So their web link is on the right there, and it links through to all of these. So if you're not sure about accessible formats, about clear printing guidance, and you're creating new signage, why not take this opportunity to make sure your signage is as usable? Even if your signage previously wasn't, now's a great time to make sure it works for everybody. And I'd really encourage you to go into this data. And I know that the Disability Collaborative Network and others are very keen to share information if you want to get in contact with them. If you have any inquiries, I know that the team there, they're really good. And I think that's a great opportunity to improve signage and accessibility. Communicating with your staff. Remember that you're not alone. Keeping close contact with your partners, collaborators, and community initiatives. If our museum community wasn't important before, it is now incredibly important. And your local community and the wider community, make sure you don't neglect these. Make sure you engage fully and bring everybody in where you can. And just kind of show a bit of love with the staff and the teams, and just there's going to be a lot of people with anxieties, various concerns. Do that where you can. So we're coming to the end of the session now. Again, another one of my quotes. I haven't had too many today. And I think just to kind of just pause and take a breath at the end of these two training sessions, which I'm hoping you've got some key takeaways from. I'm hoping actually maybe it's kind of highlighted some areas you hadn't thought about previously. It's giving you a sense of guidance, but ultimately that you've felt a sense of community here, and you felt that you've been part and understood the wider museum response around the UK and around the world. So I just like this quote here, which says, "There is no fast track back to normal. Rather than making a return to normal our goal. We must learn from this crisis in order to effectively respond, mitigate, adapt, and integrate." So what I take from this is we are evolving, we are changing. With this COVID response is one of many challenges we may face. A lot of the commentary that's going on at the moment, we are responding to COVID. The climate crisis is the one that's kind of peeking its head around the corner next. We will be having to respond to that. There will be economic crises off the back of the COVID impact, unfortunately. We need to think about responses now that are flexible, that can be changed, that can be moved towards whatever that next crisis is. And one thing that this sector is fantastic at is responding, is changing, is evolving, is collaborating. So I'd really encourage you to all think about that as we go forward from this point. And that's where we are at the end of a rather big topic that we've covered off in a total space of 4 hours. I'm hoping you've taken a lot from that. If you've got any questions at the moment, we've still got a few minutes. Happy if you put anything in the chat that we can talk about. Kay's going to put loads of links on in the chat function. I don't know. I'm looking at Kay here. We may even share the chats as a document potentially to the attendees. I don't know, so I can't promise that. So I'm just saying that is an option. Or at a very minimum, we could definitely share all of the links that have come through this, so you can peruse these at your own time. There's some really good guidance out there. As I've said before, the National Museum Directors Council, if you were to download, print one document and get your highlighter pen out, it's a really good starting point while you're planning for reopening. The AIM Museum reopening checklist is another really good kickoff point. And so I remain available, happy to take questions. You can find me, by the way, you can find me on social media, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. You can direct message me there. Always happy to answer questions and bring you into other networks that I'm involved in, for example, Museum Toilets and the Cultural Sector FM Hub, that are all kind of free communities that we try and build conversations around. Yes, but thank you all for attending, and thanks for all your input on the chat. I hope it's been a worthwhile session, and yeah, best of luck with your reopening planning. And yeah, I look forward to seeing many and all of your sites reopening in the near future. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thanks for that. Obviously, again, another great canter through this huge topic. So what we're going to do after today is obviously circulate our evaluation form. So it would be great if you could complete that. With that, we'll circulate the presentations that Ben's done, and also we'll send you all the links and any sort of relevant things that came out of the chat and all the links that you shared this morning. So they'll come out this afternoon. Obviously, both sessions have been recorded, they'll be edited, and then we'll be able to share those back with you and the sort of wider museum community. But if you've got any other questions or any other feedback, feel free to email me. You know, I'm happy to pass anything on to Ben as well, inquiries. So thanks very much for attending. Thank you.